The unseen hero. The sun had barely begun to rise, painting the horizon in soft oranges and pinks, as Marcus Taylor adjusted his gloves and prepared for another routine day at work. The world was quiet, the streets still wrapped in the gentle hush of dawn. To Marcus, this silence was both a blessing and a burden. It gave him time to think, though thinking often meant revisiting moments he preferred to leave behind. As he pulled the garbage truck into the depot, the faint hum of engines and the chatter of other workers greeted him. He parked and headed toward the front desk to clock in. It was supposed to be just another day of picking up discarded remnants of other people's lives. "Taylor," the admin called out, stopping him mid-stride. "Manager wants to see you in his office." Marcus's stomach tightened. The events of the previous day came rushing back, rescuing the young girl, Lucy, from her abusive father, using his garbage truck as a barrier to help the police arrest the man. He knew this meeting was inevitable. What he didn't know was whether it would end with him keeping his job. Taking a deep breath, Marcus knocked on the manager's door. "Come in," a gruff voice called. Steeling himself, he stepped inside. The manager, Mr. Cooper, sat behind his desk, his salt and pepper hair combed neatly, his glasses perched low on his nose as he reviewed a stack of papers. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Marcus," he began, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit down. We need to talk." Marcus sat, clasping his hands together to keep them from trembling. "I know why I'm here, sir," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "And I take full responsibility for what happened yesterday." Mr. Cooper leaned back, studying Marcus for a moment. "Why don't you start by telling me your side of the story?" Taking a deep breath, Marcus recounted everything. The moment he noticed the distressed woman and her daughter, the confrontation with the abusive father, the split-second decision to use the garbage truck to block the man's escape. As he spoke, he saw the manager's stern expression soften slightly. When Marcus finished, there was a moment of silence. Finally, Mr. Cooper sighed. "You broke protocol, Marcus. You put yourself in a dangerous situation. But," he paused, his gaze meeting Marcus's, "you also saved a life. Probably more than one." Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet," Mr. Cooper said, leaning forward. "I'm not letting you off the hook entirely. You can't make heroics a habit. We have rules for a reason. But given the circumstances, I won't penalize you this time." Relief flooded Marcus, and he nodded earnestly. "Understood, sir. It won't happen again." "Good," Mr. Cooper said, standing. "Now, there's another matter. Your partner is still out sick, so you'll be training a new guy today." Before Marcus could respond, the door opened, and a young man walked in. He was tall, with dark, amber-toned skin, and long curly hair tied back neatly. His expression was a mix of eagerness and nervousness. "This is Connor," Mr. Cooper introduced. "He's new, and you're going to show him the ropes. Make sure he learns everything he needs to know. And Marcus," he paused, his tone firm, "stick to the route. No surprises." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the reminder. "Yes, sir." The truck rumbled to life as Marcus guided Connor through the morning's route. The young man was chatty, his melodic accent betraying a Cuban heritage. He explained how he'd recently moved to the area, seeking a quieter life after years in bustling Los Angeles. Marcus listened, offering polite responses, but his mind wandered back to the neighborhood where yesterday's events had unfolded. As they reached Brightwood, Marcus felt his chest tighten. The familiar houses loomed ahead, and he couldn't stop his eyes from darting toward one in particular. The curtains were drawn, and the overflowing garbage bins on the curb spoke of a hurried attempt to erase the past. Marcus's hands tightened on the wheel. "Hey, Marcus." Connor's voice broke through his thoughts. "What's the deal with this house? Everyone at the depot was talking about it." Marcus hesitated. "It's a long story," he said finally, his voice tight. Connor didn't press further, sensing the weight behind the words. Instead, he focused on operating the truck's mechanical arm, his movements careful and precise under Marcus's guidance. As Marcus stepped out to handle the garbage, he noticed the remnants of chaos in the bins: broken photo frames, splintered wood, and a torn suitcase. Each item told a story of pain, of a family trying to rebuild after devastation. His heart ached for the girl and her mother. Suddenly, movement in the house caught his eye. The door opened, and Rachel, the girl's mother, stepped out. She looked exhausted but determined. Her eyes met Marcus's, and she hesitated before approaching. "Good morning," Marcus said, offering a small smile. Rachel nodded, her expression softening. "Morning. I just wanted to. Thank you again. For everything." Before Marcus could respond, a piercing scream tore through the air, shattering the fragile calm. Both he and Rachel spun toward the sound, their eyes widening in horror. Shadows of yesterday. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Brightwood as Marcus adjusted his gloves, his mind already buzzing with thoughts of the day ahead. His new partner, Connor, sat beside him in the cab, carefully studying the controls of the garbage truck as Marcus explained each function. The events of the previous day still lingered in Marcus's thoughts, heavy and unresolved. He couldn't shake the image of Lucy's terrified eyes or the desperation in Rachel's voice. "Marcus," Connor asked, breaking the silence, "what exactly happened here yesterday? Everyone at the depot keeps mentioning it, but no one gave me the full story." Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure how much he should share, but Connor's genuine curiosity made it hard to dismiss the question. "Let's just say I got involved in something that wasn't exactly in my job description," he said finally, his tone careful. "A little girl needed help, and I did what I had to do." Connor nodded, sensing there was more to the story but respecting Marcus's reticence. He turned his attention back to the route map, though Marcus could tell he was still mulling over his words. As they approached the house where the drama had unfolded, Marcus felt a familiar pang of unease. The curtains were drawn, and the garbage bins on the curb overflowed with the remnants of a tumultuous day. Shattered glass, torn clothing, broken furniture. It was as though Rachel was trying to purge every trace of her past, a painful but necessary step toward rebuilding. "Stay in the cab," Marcus said as he stepped out to handle the collection. Connor watched from the truck, his brows furrowing as Marcus moved with uncharacteristic tension. He could see that this stop wasn't like the others. Marcus opened the first bag, his hands pausing as he sifted through its contents. Among the broken items, he spotted a framed photograph, the glass cracked but the image intact. It was of Rachel, Lucy, and a man Marcus assumed to be Dennis. The man's smile felt forced, his grip on Lucy's shoulder too tight. Marcus's stomach churned as he quickly tossed the bag into the truck's compactor. Just as Marcus finished loading the last bag, the sound of a door creaking open drew his attention. Rachel stood on the porch, her face pale but resolute. Her arms were crossed, as though bracing herself against the weight of the moment. "Morning, Rachel," Marcus called out, keeping his tone light. "How are you holding up?" She stepped closer, her voice strained but steady. "We're managing. It's been a lot." Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning her face for signs of exhaustion. "I can tell you've been busy," he said, gesturing to the overflowing bins. "It looks like you're clearing out everything." Rachel sighed, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I have to. I don't want anything left that reminds us of him. Lucy needs a fresh start. We both do." Before Marcus could respond, Lucy appeared in the doorway, clutching a trash bag that was clearly too heavy for her. She struggled to carry it down the steps, her small frame straining under the weight. Marcus immediately moved to help her. "Here, Lucy," he said gently, taking the bag from her hands. "You shouldn't be lifting something this heavy." Lucy looked up at him with wide eyes, her expression a mix of gratitude and lingering fear. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel watched the exchange, her eyes welling with tears. She hasn't spoken much since yesterday, she admitted. But she keeps asking about you. She says you're her hero. Marcus felt a lump in his throat as he glanced back at Lucy. I'm just glad I could help, he said. But you're the real hero, Rachel. You're the one who's making the hard choices. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a piercing scream shattered the moment. The unseen threat. The sound came from the direction of the street, sharp and panicked. Marcus's head snapped toward the source, his heart racing. He spotted Connor jumping out of the cab, his face a mask of confusion and concern. What was that? Connor asked, hurrying over. Marcus didn't answer. His eyes scanned the street, searching for the source of the commotion. That's when he saw the black SUV idling a few houses down. Its windows were heavily tinted, and its engine rumbled ominously. Rachel, Marcus said urgently, turning back to her. Get inside. Now. Rachel's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. She grabbed Lucy's hand and hurried back into the house, locking the door behind her. Marcus stepped forward, his instincts on high alert. The SUV's engine roared to life, and it began to creep forward, its tires crunching against the gravel. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline as he placed himself between the vehicle and Rachel's house. What's going on? Connor asked, his voice tinged with panic. Stay back, Marcus ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The SUV stopped a few feet away, its driver's side door swinging open. A man stepped out, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap and sunglasses. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture exuding menace. You've got some nerve, the man called out, his voice dripping with disdain. Getting in the way of family matters. Marcus's jaw tightened. He didn't need to ask who the man was. The resemblance to the man in the photograph was undeniable. Dennis, Marcus said coldly. You're not supposed to be here. Dennis smirked, taking a step closer. And who's going to stop me? You? The garbage man. Marcus held his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. The police are on their way, he said evenly. You should leave before you make things worse for yourself. Dennis's smirk faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. You think this is over? He sneered. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Before Marcus could respond, Dennis lunged toward him. The sudden movement caught Marcus off guard, but he quickly regained his footing, sidestepping the attack. He grabbed Dennis by the arm, using his momentum to shove him away. Connor, who had been watching from a safe distance, sprang into action. He grabbed his phone and began recording the confrontation, his hands trembling slightly as he captured every detail. Dennis staggered but quickly recovered, his eyes blazing with anger. You're going to regret this, he spat, reaching into his pocket. Marcus's heart raced as he prepared for the worst. But before Dennis could pull out whatever he was reaching for, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. The sound froze Dennis in his tracks. This isn't over, Dennis growled, backing away toward the SUV. He climbed into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind him. The vehicle peeled away, its tires screeching as it sped down the street. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his chest heaving as he processed what had just happened. When the police cars finally arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the scene, he felt a wave of relief. The aftermath. The police quickly took statements from Marcus, Rachel, and Connor. Marcus recounted the events as accurately as he could, though his mind was still racing. Rachel clutched Lucy tightly, her face pale but determined. Detective Johnson, a seasoned officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached Marcus. You did good here, he said, his voice gruff but sincere. But Dennis is dangerous. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. Marcus nodded, his jaw set. Then we'll have to stop him first. A web of deceit. The tension in Brightwood's streets had settled into a nervous calm by the time Marcus returned to work the next day. The events of the previous 2 days were now the talk of the town, though most of his coworkers only knew fragments of the story. Marcus had barely slept, his mind replaying Dennis's menacing threats and the sight of Rachel clutching Lucy in desperation. This time, he wasn't sure if simply showing up for work would suffice. His gut told him that Dennis wasn't finished, and that danger was still lurking just out of sight. Connor was already waiting at the depot, his demeanor more subdued than usual. "Morning," he said, his voice quieter than the cheerful tone Marcus had grown used to. "Morning," Marcus replied, adjusting his gloves. "You good?" Connor hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just thinking about what happened yesterday. That guy, Dennis, he's not going to let this go, is he?" Marcus sighed, leaning against the truck. "People like him don't know how to let go. They think the world owes them something. But we're not going to let him win." Connor nodded, his expression resolute. "What's the plan for today?" "Same as always," Marcus said. "Stick to the route, keep our heads down. But if anything feels off, you let me know immediately." "Got it." "Got it," Connor replied, though the flicker of unease in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. A subtle warning. The morning's collections were uneventful, the monotony of the routine providing a welcome distraction for Marcus. But as they approached Brightwood, his unease began to creep back. The neighborhood felt different today. Too quiet, too still. When they arrived at Rachel's house, Marcus was relieved to see her and Lucy loading boxes into the back of an old minivan. Rachel's decision to move in with her mother had come as no surprise, and Marcus was glad to see her following through. Rachel waved as Marcus stepped out of the truck. "Hey, Marcus. Thanks for stopping by. Just doing my job," Marcus said with a small smile, though his gaze flicked toward the street. "How's everything going?" "We're getting there," Rachel replied, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "Lucy's been helping pack, but she's still shaken up. I don't think she'll feel safe until we're far away from here." Marcus nodded, glancing at Lucy, who was quietly placing a small box in the van. "She'll be okay," he said softly. "You both will." Rachel's eyes welled with tears, but she quickly brushed them away. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything." Before Marcus could respond, a sleek black car turned onto the street, its tinted windows gleaming in the sunlight. Marcus stiffened, his hand instinctively going to his pocket where his phone was tucked away. "Get inside," he said quietly to Rachel. "Now." Rachel's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. She called for Lucy, and the two of them hurried into the house, locking the door behind them. The car slowed as it approached, finally stopping in front of the house. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a man in a tailored suit with a predatory smile. His neatly combed hair and expensive sunglasses gave him an air of authority, but Marcus could see the malice lurking beneath the polished exterior. "Mr. Taylor, is it?" the man said, his voice smooth and calculated. "I've heard a lot about you." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" The man chuckled. "Let's just say I'm an interested party. I represent certain individuals who are very unhappy with the way you've been interfering in their business." "Dennis," Marcus said, his voice cold. The man's smile widened. "He's not the only one who wants you to back off. You've made some powerful enemies, Mr. Taylor." Marcus took a step closer, his fists clenching at his sides. "You can tell Dennis and anyone else involved that I'm not backing off. If they come near Rachel or Lucy again, they'll regret it." The man's expression darkened. "That's a shame. I was hoping we could come to an understanding." Before Marcus could respond, the man rolled up his window and the car sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Marcus stood there for a moment, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about Dennis anymore. This was bigger, more dangerous. Unraveling the threads. When Marcus returned to the truck, Connor was waiting, his face pale. "Who was that?" "Trouble," Marcus muttered, climbing into the cab. "Let's finish the route and get back to the depot." But as they continued their work, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every turn seemed to reveal another black car parked inconspicuously, its occupants hidden behind tinted windows. He tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the nagging sense of unease wouldn't let him relax. When they finally returned to the depot, Marcus headed straight for the manager's office. He needed answers, and he had a feeling Mr. Cooper might know more than he was letting on. "Marcus," Cooper said, looking up from his paperwork as Marcus entered. "What's going on?" "I need to know if anyone's been asking about me," Marcus said, his tone firm. "Anyone unusual?" Cooper frowned. "What's this about?" Marcus hesitated, then told him everything. Dennis's threats, the black car, the man in the suit. Cooper's expression grew graver with each detail. "Marcus," he said finally, "you need to be careful. If Dennis has connections to people with that kind of influence, you're in over your head." "I don't care," Marcus said, his voice hard. "They're not going to scare me off." Cooper sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, I'll keep an eye out. But you need to be smart about this. Don't do anything reckless." The missing piece. That evening, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. He sat in his small apartment, poring over every detail of the past few days, trying to piece together the bigger picture. Then it hit him, the envelope Connor had mentioned. The one Dennis had received at the liquor store. Marcus hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it seemed like a critical piece of the puzzle. He picked up his phone and dialed Detective Johnson. "Detective, it's Marcus. I think I know how Dennis is planning to disappear." "What do you mean?" Johnson asked, his tone sharp. Marcus explained his theory about the envelope and its possible connection to forged documents. "If we can trace that envelope back to its source, we might be able to figure out Dennis's next move." Johnson was silent for a moment, then said, "That's a good lead, Marcus. I'll have my team look into it. But you need to stay out of this. Let us handle it." "I will," Marcus lied, already formulating a plan. The hunter and the prey. The black car's visit had changed everything. Marcus couldn't shake the chilling words of the suited man. This wasn't just Dennis anymore. There was a larger, more dangerous force involved, and they were watching him. He spent the evening pacing his small apartment, replaying the events in his mind. Every detail, the envelope, the liquor store, Dennis's threats, felt like a piece of a puzzle he hadn't quite solved yet. By the time dawn broke, Marcus had made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for the police to piece things together. He was going to take matters into his own hands. A mysterious lead. Marcus started with the liquor store, the last confirmed location where Dennis had been spotted. He knew the store clerk might be hesitant to talk, so he approached carefully, his demeanor calm but determined. The bell above the door jingled as Marcus entered. The young clerk behind the counter stiffened when he saw him, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You again," the clerk said, his voice a mix of nervousness and annoyance. "I already talked to the cops." Marcus leaned on the counter, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to know what was in that envelope Dennis picked up." The clerk shook his head. "I told them. I don't know. I didn't open it. I just handed it over like I was told." "Told by who?" Marcus pressed. The clerk hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. "Look, I don't want any problems, okay? I just do what the boss tells me." Marcus's patience was wearing thin. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "If you know something and you're not saying it, you're putting a little girl's life in danger. Do you really want that on your conscience?" The clerk paled, his hands trembling slightly. Okay. There's this guy, Bold Nyans. Well, let's just say he's not the kind of person you want to cross. He runs some kind of operation out of a bar on the east side of town. I think that's where the envelope came from." Marcus nodded, filing the name and location away. "Thank you," he said simply before turning to leave. "Hey," the clerk called after him. "Be careful. If Bold finds out you're poking around, It won't end well for you." Marcus didn't respond. He was already out the door, into the shadows. The bar the clerk mentioned was the kind of place people went to be forgotten. Its neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement outside. Marcus parked his truck a block away, not wanting to draw attention, and approached on foot. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke. The dim lighting made it difficult to see clearly, but Marcus's eyes quickly adjusted. He scanned the room, noting the patrons, grizzled men hunched over their drinks, a few shady figures exchanging hushed words in the corner, and a bartender who watched Marcus with wary eyes. Marcus approached the bar, his shoulders squared. "I'm looking for Bold Nyans," he said, his voice steady. The bartender raised an eyebrow. "Never heard of him." Marcus wasn't buying it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photo he'd taken of the liquor store's security footage, showing Dennis picking up the envelope. "I think he works with this guy." The bartender's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked toward the back room for the briefest of moments. It was all the confirmation Marcus needed. "Thanks," Marcus said, turning and heading for the door the bartender's gaze had betrayed. "Hey," the bartender called after him. "You can't go back there." Marcus ignored him, pushing open the door and stepping into a narrow hallway. At the end of the hall was another door, this one guarded by a burly man with arms like tree trunks. "You lost?" the man asked, his tone laced with menace. "I'm here to see Bold," Marcus said, his voice firm. The man chuckled, crossing his arms over his massive chest. "And who the hell are you?" "Someone who doesn't have time for games," Marcus replied, taking a step closer. "Now you can let me through, or we can do this the hard way." The guard's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Before he could respond, the door behind him opened and a voice called out, "Let him in." The guard stepped aside, and Marcus walked through the door, his senses on high alert. The web revealed. The room was dimly lit, with walls lined with filing cabinets and a desk cluttered with papers. Behind the desk sat a man who could only be Bold Nyans. He was lean and sharp-featured, with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through Marcus. "Mr. Taylor," Bold said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "I've been expecting you." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I doubt that." Bold chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You've been causing quite a stir. Dennis Harper, the liquor store, even my bar. You've been busy." "I'm not here for games," Marcus said coldly. "I want to know what Dennis is planning, and I want to know now." Bold's smile widened. "And why would I tell you that?" "Because if you don't," Marcus said, taking a step closer, "I'll make sure the cops know exactly where to find you and what you're running here." Bold's expression darkened, the jovial mask slipping for a moment. "You're bold, I'll give you that. But you're in over your head." Marcus didn't flinch. "Try me." There was a long silence as the two men stared each other down. Finally, Bold sighed, reaching into a drawer and pulling out a manila folder. He slid it across the desk toward Marcus. "Dennis paid me to create new identities for him and his daughter," Bold admitted. "Passports, birth certificates, the works. He's planning to leave the country." "Where?" Marcus demanded, snatching up the folder. Bold shrugged. "That I don't know. But I do know he was in a hurry. He wanted everything ready by the end of the week." Marcus opened the folder, his heart sinking as he scanned the forged documents. They were flawless. If Dennis managed to use them, tracking him down would be nearly impossible. "Why tell me this?" Marcus asked, narrowing his eyes at Bold. Bold leaned forward, his expression serious. "Because Dennis is bad for business. He's reckless, and he's dragging me into his mess. If he gets caught, he might take me down with him. Consider this my way of cutting ties." Marcus didn't trust Bold's motives, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He had what he needed, a chance to stop Dennis before it was too late. The clock is ticking. As Marcus left the bar, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Detective Johnson. "Taylor," the detective said, his tone urgent. "We've got a lead on Dennis. One of our patrols spotted his SUV near the old industrial district. We're moving in now." "I'm on my way," Marcus replied, already heading for his truck. "Stay out of it, Marcus," Johnson warned. "This is a police operation." But Marcus wasn't listening. He couldn't shake the image of Lucy's terrified face. He had promised Rachel he would protect her, and he wasn't about to break that promise. The final gambit. The industrial district loomed ahead like a graveyard of forgotten dreams. Rusted machinery, broken windows, and towering smokestacks painted a grim picture of abandonment. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. Detective Johnson's warning to stay out of it echoed in his head, but he knew he couldn't sit back and wait. He had come too far to let Dennis slip away. As he approached the address Johnson had mentioned, Marcus parked his truck several blocks away and continued on foot. The air was thick with the metallic tang of rust, and the faint hum of machinery in the distance hinted at signs of life. He kept to the shadows, his eyes scanning for any sign of Dennis or his accomplices. The trap is set. The abandoned warehouse came into view, its towering structure partially obscured by a chain-link fence. Several black SUVs were parked outside, their engines still warm. Marcus crouched behind a pile of scrap metal, watching as two men emerged from the building. They were armed, their movements deliberate and coordinated. Marcus's stomach tightened. This wasn't just Dennis anymore. These men were professionals. He needed a plan. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, dialing Detective Johnson. "Johnson," came the curt reply. "It's Marcus," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm at the warehouse in the industrial district. Dennis is here. And he's not alone. There are armed men." Johnson swore under his breath. "We're on our way. Do not engage, Marcus. I mean it." "Just hurry," Marcus said before hanging up. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath. Waiting wasn't his strong suit, especially not when Lucy's life was on the line. He knew he couldn't take on the armed men, but he could gather more intel. Staying low, he crept closer to the warehouse. Inside the lair, the side entrance was partially ajar, a sliver of light spilling onto the cracked pavement. Marcus slipped inside, his footsteps silent on the concrete floor. The interior of the warehouse was vast, with stacks of crates and towering shelves providing ample cover. Voices echoed from a room at the far end. Marcus moved carefully, keeping to the shadows as he approached. Peering through a gap in the doorway, he spotted Dennis standing with two of the armed men. Lucy was seated in a chair against the wall, her hands bound, but otherwise unharmed. "Everything's ready," Dennis was saying, his voice tight with urgency. "The plane's fueled and waiting. We just need to get out of here before the cops show up." One of the men, a tall figure with a scar running down his cheek, nodded. "We'll move as soon as Bold calls with the all clear." Marcus's blood boiled at the sight of Lucy, her wide eyes filled with fear. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. He needed a distraction. The reckless gambit. Marcus spotted a stack of metal pipes leaning precariously against one of the shelves. An idea began to form. If he could knock them over, the noise would create enough chaos for him to grab Lucy and make a run for it. He moved quickly but carefully, positioning himself near the pipes. With a sharp tug, he pulled the bottom pipe free, sending the entire stack crashing to the ground with a deafening clang. "What the hell was that?" one of the men shouted, drawing his weapon. As the men rushed to investigate the noise, Marcus slipped into the room. Dennis turned just as Marcus reached him, his eyes widening in shock. "You," Dennis spat, reaching for a weapon tucked into his waistband. Marcus didn't hesitate. He lunged at Dennis, knocking the weapon from his hand and sending him sprawling to the ground. Lucy screamed, her chair tipping over as she tried to free herself. "Run, Lucy," Marcus shouted, his voice hoarse with adrenaline. Lucy struggled against her bindings, her eyes darting between Marcus and the commotion unfolding around her. Dennis recovered quickly, scrambling to his feet and swinging wildly at Marcus. The blow landed, sending Marcus staggering backward. But he didn't falter. "You're not taking her," Marcus growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Not today." The cavalry arrives. The sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder by the second. Marcus felt a surge of relief. The police were close, but he wasn't sure they'd make it in time. The two armed men returned, their weapons drawn. "We've got company," one of them barked. "Cops are everywhere." Dennis cursed, his face contorted with rage. "We're not leaving without her." "Over my dead body," Marcus said, positioning himself between Lucy and the armed men. Before the situation could escalate further, the warehouse doors burst open, and a swarm of police officers flooded in. Shouts filled the air as the officers ordered the men to drop their weapons. Dennis made a desperate move, grabbing Lucy and pulling her to her feet. He held a knife to her throat, his eyes wild. "Stay back," he screamed. "I'll do it." "Let her go, Dennis," Detective Johnson shouted, his weapon trained on the man. "It's over." Marcus's heart pounded as he saw Lucy's terrified face. He knew he couldn't wait for Dennis to make a move. Summoning every ounce of courage, he charged forward, knocking Dennis off balance and forcing him to release Lucy. Lucy stumbled but was quickly scooped up by Detective Johnson. Dennis hit the ground hard, his knife clattering away as officers swarmed him, pinning him down. The aftermath. The warehouse was a flurry of activity as officers secured the scene and escorted the suspects out in handcuffs. Marcus sat on the edge of a crate, his body aching, but his heart light with relief. Rachel arrived moments later, tears streaming down her face as she embraced Lucy. "Thank you," she whispered to Marcus, her voice breaking. "Thank you for bringing her back." Marcus managed a tired smile. "I told you I'd protect her." Detective Johnson approached, his expression a mix of admiration and exasperation. "You've got guts, Taylor. Reckless, but gutsy." "Had to do what I had to do," Marcus said simply. Johnson nodded, extending a hand. "Well, you did good. We'll take it from here." As Marcus walked out of the warehouse, the morning sun breaking through the clouds, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had faced danger head-on, fought for what was right, and come out the other side stronger. For the first time in a long time, Marcus Taylor felt like a hero. A new dawn. The events at the warehouse were over, but the echoes of that night lingered in Marcus's mind as he sat at the kitchen table of his small apartment. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the wall. He stared at the steaming mug of coffee in his hands, its warmth doing little to soothe the storm of emotions swirling within him. Lucy was safe. Dennis was behind bars. The professionals assured him that Rachel and Lucy would be moved to a safe location while Dennis awaited trial. Yet Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't entirely over. People like Dennis didn't give up easily. A visit from Rachel. The next morning, as Marcus prepared to head to work, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find Rachel standing there, Lucy clutching her hand. Rachel's eyes were puffy from lack of sleep, but there was a calm determination in her expression. "Can we come in?" she asked. Marcus stepped aside, his heart skipping a beat. "Of course." Rachel and Lucy entered, the little girl glancing around nervously before settling into a chair. Rachel placed a small box on the table and took a deep breath. "I wanted to thank you," Rachel began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Not just for what you did last night, but for everything. You saved us, Marcus. Twice." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, scratching the back of his neck. "I just did what anyone would have done." Rachel shook her head. "No, most people would have looked the other way. You didn't." She opened the box, revealing a small handmade card and a carefully wrapped gift. Lucy stood and walked over, holding the card out to Marcus. Her voice was quiet, but her words were clear. "This is for you." Marcus took the card, his hands trembling slightly. On the front was a simple drawing of a man standing in front of a garbage truck, with the words "Our Hero" written in a child's careful handwriting. Inside, Lucy had written a single sentence: "Thank you for being brave when I couldn't." The lump in Marcus's throat made it hard to speak. "Thank you, Lucy," he managed, his voice thick. "This means a lot." Rachel smiled faintly. "We're leaving today. The police are taking us to a safe house until everything with Dennis is sorted out. I just wanted you to know. You've given us a chance to start over." Marcus nodded, a mix of relief and sadness washing over him. "That's all I wanted. A new threat." That afternoon, Marcus went about his route as usual, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. As he and Connor collected trash in Brightwood, Marcus noticed a black sedan parked at the end of the street. It wasn't unusual to see cars in the neighborhood, but something about this one felt off. The windows were tinted, and the engine was idling. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to pay attention. "Connor," he said, nodding toward the car. "You see that?" Connor followed his gaze, his expression darkening. "Yeah, you think it's them?" "Maybe," Marcus replied. "Stay here. I'm going to check it out." Connor hesitated but nodded, watching as Marcus approached the car. As he got closer, the driver's window rolled down just a fraction, revealing a pair of cold, calculating eyes. "You're persistent," the driver said, his voice low and even. "And you're predictable." Marcus shot back. "What do you want?" The man smirked. "To remind you that this isn't over. You've made enemies, Mr. Taylor. Powerful ones. Enjoy your victory while it lasts." The window rolled up, and the car sped away before Marcus could respond. He stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. The message was clear. This wasn't just about Dennis anymore. Someone else was pulling the strings, and they weren't done with him yet. Detective Johnson's warning. Later that evening, Marcus met with Detective Johnson to relay what had happened. The detective listened carefully, his expression growing grimmer by the second. "This complicates things," Johnson admitted. "If Dennis has connections to people outside of our jurisdiction, this could turn into something much bigger than we anticipated." "Then what do we do?" Marcus asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "We keep an eye on you, for starters," Johnson said. "And we dig deeper into Dennis's network. But Marcus, you need to be careful. These people don't play by the rules." Marcus nodded, though the warning did little to ease his mind. He had a sinking feeling that the fight was far from over. The turning point. As the days passed, Marcus tried to settle back into his routine, but the unease never left him. He began noticing more strange cars in his neighborhood, unfamiliar faces lingering too long near his truck, and cryptic messages left on his phone. Someone was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, as Marcus sat in his apartment, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It read, "Meet me at the depot at midnight. Come alone." Marcus stared at the message, his heart pounding. He didn't know who had sent it, but he couldn't ignore it. He grabbed his coat and headed out, determined to get answers. The midnight meeting. The garbage depot was eerily quiet at night, the usual hum of activity replaced by an unsettling stillness. Marcus parked his truck and stepped out, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Marcus," a voice called, low and urgent. He turned to see a figure stepping out from behind a stack of bins. It was Bold Nyans. "You've got guts showing up," Marcus said, his tone cold. "What do you want?" Bold raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Relax, Taylor. I'm here to help." "Help?" Marcus echoed, his skepticism clear. "Why would you want to help me?" "Because the people coming after you are the same ones who left me out to dry," Bold said, his voice bitter. "Dennis was just a pawn. The real power lies with the syndicate he was working for. And if they're targeting you, it's because they think you're a threat. Marcus frowned. What kind of syndicate? Human trafficking, money laundering, forgery, you name it, Bold replied. They'd got their hands in everything, and they don't like loose ends. And you're one of those loose ends? Marcus asked. Bold nodded. That's why I need your help. We can take them down together. Marcus hesitated, his instincts telling him not to trust Bold. But he couldn't deny that the man had information he needed. All right, Marcus said finally. But if you cross me, you'll regret it. Bold smirked. Fair enough. The next chapter. As the two men hashed out a plan, Marcus realized that his fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The syndicate was a far bigger enemy than Dennis could ever be, and taking them down would require every ounce of courage and determination he had. But as he looked back on everything he'd been through, Marcus knew one thing for certain. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The final reckoning. The night air at the depot was heavy with tension as Marcus and Bold stood in the dim glow of a single overhead light. The stakes had never been higher, and Marcus knew that this was his moment to act. Bold's offer to work together was risky, but it was also his only lead to dismantle the syndicate threatening not only his life, but Rachel and Lucy's safety. What's the plan? Marcus asked, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Bold glanced around nervously, his usual bravado tempered by genuine fear. There's a meeting tomorrow night. The syndicate's leaders are gathering at a private estate on the outskirts of town. It's their safe house, but they're not expecting trouble. And you know this how? Marcus pressed, narrowing his eyes. I've been their go-to guy for years, Bold admitted. I handled their forgery operations, set up their escape routes. I know the patterns, but they don't trust me anymore, which means I'm expendable. If we're going to take them down, we have to strike now. Marcus nodded, his mind racing. What kind of security are we looking at? Armed guards, high-tech surveillance. The works, Bold said grimly. We'll need help. A risky alliance. The next morning, Marcus met with Detective Johnson, laying everything on the table. Johnson listened intently, his expression shifting from skepticism to determination as Marcus and Bold explained the syndicate's operation and the planned meeting. This is big, Johnson said, leaning back in his chair. If we can take these guys down, it'll be one of the largest busts in state history. But it's dangerous, Marcus. I can't let you get involved. I'm already involved, Marcus countered. These people came after me, after Rachel and Lucy. I'm not sitting this one out. Johnson sighed, rubbing his temples. Fine, but you follow my lead. One wrong move, and this whole thing could blow up in our faces. With Johnson's agreement, the plan was set. An elite SWAT team would accompany Marcus and Bold to the estate, ready to strike once they had confirmation of the syndicate's presence. Bold would act as their inside man, gaining entry and signaling when it was time to move. The estate. The estate was a sprawling compound hidden behind high walls and dense trees. Under the cover of darkness, the SWAT team moved into position, their black uniforms blending seamlessly with the shadows. Marcus and Bold watched from a nearby ridge, their hearts pounding as they surveyed the heavily guarded perimeter. Bold adjusted the small earpiece in his ear. Once I'm inside, I'll signal you, he said quietly. You wait for my go. Be careful, Marcus said, his voice low but firm. If this goes south, we're both dead. Bold smirked, though the tension in his eyes betrayed his nerves. You're not the only one who's brave, Taylor. With that, Bold slipped down the ridge and approached the estate's gate. Marcus watched through binoculars as Bold exchanged a few words with one of the guards before being led inside. The minutes that followed felt like hours, every second stretching into an eternity. The signal. Finally, the earpiece crackled to life. I'm in, Bold whispered. The leaders are all here. Now's your chance. Johnson gave the signal, and the SWAT team sprang into action. Moving with precision, they breached the estate's perimeter, neutralizing guards with quiet efficiency. Marcus followed closely behind, his heart pounding as they approached the main building. Inside, chaos erupted. The leaders of the syndicate scrambled as the SWAT team stormed the meeting room. Marcus spotted Dennis among them, his face twisting with fury as he was tackled to the ground and cuffed. "It's over, Dennis," Marcus said, standing over him. "You're done." Dennis glared up at him, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think this changes anything? There's always someone else. You can't stop us." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. The sight of Dennis being dragged away in cuffs was enough. Justice served. By dawn, the operation was complete. The syndicate's leaders had been arrested, their network dismantled. The evidence recovered from the estate was enough to ensure that Dennis and his accomplices would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. At the police station, Marcus sat with Rachel and Lucy, who had been brought in for their safety. Rachel's eyes were red from crying, but her relief was palpable. "It's over," Marcus said softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now." Rachel looked at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "You did it, Marcus. You saved us." Lucy, clutching her handmade card, ran over and threw her arms around Marcus. "You're my hero," she whispered. Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. "You're pretty brave yourself, kiddo." A new beginning. In the weeks that followed, life began to return to normal. Rachel and Lucy moved to a new city, starting fresh, without the shadow of Dennis hanging over them. They stayed in touch with Marcus, sending him updates and pictures of their new life. As for Marcus, he returned to his job at the garbage depot, but things were different now. He was no longer just a garbage man. He was a man who had faced down danger and emerged stronger. And while he didn't seek recognition, the gratitude of Rachel and Lucy was enough to remind him that he had made a difference. One quiet evening, as Marcus sat on his porch watching the sunset, his phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "Lucy and I are doing great. She made this for you today." Attached was a photo of a new drawing, a man standing tall, a garbage truck in the background, and a shining sun overhead. Above it, Lucy had written, "Our hero forever." Marcus smiled, his heart full. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The shadows of the past had lifted, and a new dawn had begun.